Now, before writing any Flutter or Dart code, I want to walk you through the important folders and files that were created when you created a new Flutter project. And for this section, you can either create a new Flutter project anywhere on your hard drive in the folder where you want to manage all your Flutter projects, for example, or you use that Flutter project which we created in the previous course section. Either way, you should make sure that you use the main.dart file, which you find attached to this lecture, to replace your main.dart file in the lib folder with. So the main.dart file in the lib folder in that project which you opened and which you now have open should be that main.dart file you find attached. And with that, you should have a new Flutter project, and the exact number of folders could change over time, but you should see a bunch of folders in there. And as you might have guessed already, the lib folder, for example, is a rather important folder, because it's that lib folder that contains your actual Dart code files. So the files in which you will store the Dart and Flutter code that makes up your application. At the moment in there, we got only one file, but as you will see throughout this section and the entire course, you can add multiple files in that folder, and you can then also combine these files to split your app code across multiple folders, which you simply typically do to keep your individual code files manageable and readable. So at the moment it's one file, and what's of course important about this file is that it ends with .dart. As mentioned in the first course section, Dart is the programming language that's used by Flutter to build apps with Flutter, and your code files must end with .dart, therefore, also to tell Visual Studio Code, or whichever code editor you're using, that the content in that file is Dart code, which then allows the code editor to give you proper support and code formatting and highlighting of certain keywords, as you can see here on the right. Because that's one of the main ideas behind using a code editor, that you get some syntax highlighting, as it's called, so that certain keywords are highlighted, that it helps you catch typos and do many other things for you. And in order for the editor to properly support you, it of course must know in which language you're writing your code, and that file extension does help the code editor with that. So this main.dart file in the lib folder is important, and the lib folder therefore is important, but it of course is not the only file and folder you have in that project. Instead, you should also see an Android folder, you should see a build folder, you should see a Windows folder, a web folder, and also a couple of other folders, as you can see here. Now, these folders that carry platform names, like Android or macOS or web or Windows, simply contain platform-specific files. Typically, you don't need to do anything with the files in those folders. Instead, Flutter will change and configure those files for you when needed. So you don't need to do anything with the files and folders in those platform folders. They will be managed by Flutter, but they still are important because they are used under the hood when you run your Flutter project as an app on an Android or iOS simulator, and of course also later when you prepare your app for deployment, when you prepare it to be published to the Android store or the Apple App Store. So whenever you want to publish an app to a specific platform, the files and folders in the respective platform folder will become important. The build folder is also important, but also a folder in which you won't work. It only contains temporary files and output files generated by Flutter as it builds your app for different target platforms. So you shouldn't change anything in there, but it is an important folder that's also managed automatically for you by Flutter. Now in the test folder, you also find Dart files. But unlike the lib folder, the test folder is not a folder where you will write your main application code. Instead, in there, you could write code that tests your main application code. You could define automated tests, which can be very useful for catching errors early and for making sure that you don't have to test everything manually. Now, testing automated testing is an advanced topic and not something we will cover here in this course, but you can still keep this folder around even though we won't work in it. And then you also got many more files and also more folders up there. Now these folders, starting with a dot, simply hold some extra configuration. For example, the .idea folder contains some extra configuration for Android Studio. Dart tool contains some extra configuration for some, guess what, Dart tooling. And you don't need to tweak those configurations typically, so you can also ignore these folders here. And then when it comes to all these files down there, we got more configuration files. Gitignore is a file that's used by Git, this version control software, which you can use for managing code snapshots and going back to snapshots if you messed something up, for example. But you don't have to use Git when using Flutter, so you therefore can ignore that file. You also shouldn't delete it though. Now, .metadata is actually a file that is managed automatically by Flutter to keep track of some internal information and metadata about your project. So you should not delete that file, but you also shouldn't edit it. The analysis options YAML file configures some Flutter and Dart tooling that's being used by your code editor to show you warnings and errors in your code before you even run the app, which is amazing for catching errors early. And typically the default settings here should suffice and should give you everything you need. But once you're a bit more advanced, you could definitely dive into this file to tweak those settings to your likings, so that, for example, a certain style of writing your code is enforced, so that you get warnings if you accidentally use another style or anything like that. This is advanced though, and something you can therefore ignore initially. Now this first app IML file is another file that's managed by Flutter for you, and you can therefore ignore it. It contains more metadata and information for building your Flutter app for different platforms. The pubspec.log file is another managed file which you should ignore, but it is connected to this pubspec.yaml file, which is an important file that you may edit and that we will edit at certain points in this course. Because this pubspec.yaml file, for example, allows you to add third-party packages to your Flutter project. So if you want to add some feature to your app, which you don't want to build on your own because it's too cumbersome or complicated, but it's also not built into Flutter or Dart, you could bring in a third-party package, and you will see some examples for that throughout the course, and you would add those packages and refer to them inside of this pubspec.yaml file. So it's not a file you need to edit right now, but we will edit this file from time to time. For example, also in this section already to include images into our Flutter project. But again, you will see how that works once it's time for that. At the moment, you can ignore that file. Well, and the README file simply contains some general information about this project that was created, a short description, and some resources you can visit to dive deeper into Flutter, which you of course don't need because you have this course. And with that, you now have a first idea of what all these folders and files do. Of course, you will see many of these files and many settings in action throughout the course as we need them.